All right, we through our 32 created lessons. We've done our capital letter lesson, our letter writing lesson, and our arithmetic lesson. Now we get to the next section of lessons and farming stories and our Bible stories. And we're going to talk now about what we're going to do to edit those. Now keep in mind that we have a total of 12 health and farming stories. Our subjects are clean water, good food, healthy stomach, diarrhea, milk for baby, mosquitoes and flies, cleanliness and tuberculosis, latrines, AIDS, and then about farming we have growing food all year, making compost, and using compost. Now these are preset stories that are in the advanced preparation package that are to be translated ahead of time. But before you begin work on these stories with your team, you want to check to see that the topics are relevant to that area. And so you want to go through with the team and look at all of these, and they may say, "Oh, this is not something that we need to worry about for our area. We would like to do something else." So any that aren't relevant, don't include them in the primer. There's no point in putting them in. For example, latrines. In Zavadi language in Nigeria, the missionaries, when we were looking at this, the teams, we were looking at this, says, we've been trying to get the people to use latrines for 20 years, and they're just not going to do it. So there's no point in putting that in. So they decided they wanted to put in a lesson instead about cuts and burns because so many people had machete cuts and were getting burned in fires and about what to do about that. So we took out the latrine story and put in one about cuts and burns. In Sindhi language of Pakistan, the group we were working with did a lot of work with new moms. And so they said, well, the milk for baby we don't really need, but what we'd rather have is a story about how to transition to wean baby and the first foods baby should eat, when to wean baby and what they should eat. And so they wrote a simple story for that. So we want to keep the lesson numbers the same just because of the format of the primer. There's a lot of good topics, but we want the most common difficulties that are in that area for that people group. And like I said, if the team wants different topics, that's fine, but then they will need to write simple stories for that topic. Then we also have our 36 Bible stories. I'll put myself over here. So we have our 11 Old Testament stories, and then we have 2 stories on transitioning, kind of people need a better sacrifice, talking about that the old sacrificial system didn't really work and that God promises the Messiah, looking at some of the prophets and the prophecies about the coming of the Messiah. And then we head into the New Testament. We have 23 New Testament stories, starting with the birth of Jesus and going all the way to stories in Acts, and then our home in heaven, about the second coming of Christ and our home in heaven with him. So we have, all told, we have the 12 health and farming stories and then the 36 Bible stories. So we still have a whopping 42 stories to get through. So it feels good to get to the end of those 32 created stories, but we still have a large section of the primer to do. So don't fear, don't worry. We'll get through it all. And it may seem like too much, but it all works together to get through. So for the health and farming stories, the initial translations are done as part of the advanced preparations and the Bible stories. And those are translated from language. We have the advanced preparation materials in French, English, Spanish, and Portuguese. So whatever the kind of the main languages of that area, they'll make those translations from that. And that's done so that the language speakers who are working in the language may not know how to read and write that language. So, for instance, they may not know English, they may know like Hausa or a trade language, and so we want them to have an initial translation to work with. But most likely, there's too many new words in those stories because they didn't have any word control going on when they did those initial translations. So remember, we're going to have 12 new words for the health and farming stories and 21 new words for the Bible stories. And we need to edit stories for new word control and just to kind of make sure that they're simple for the new reader. But you want to make sure you keep those original translations. And one thing we tell the team, because sometimes I get a little bit um, irritated that you're chopping up, they have to chop up their very good translations. And you just remind them it's not because the translations are bad, it's just because we need to edit them for the new word control and to help the new reader. But those original translations can be made into another booklet, so that'll be at another level that can be used later and are still very useful. So what's going to happen is as you've completed those 32 Bible stories and you've done those other lessons, now the new word control person checks the number of new words in the stories prior to the team editing. And this is where, if you've got that custom dictionary, it really, really, really comes in handy to find those new words. Otherwise, it's a very tedious job at this point. So the new word person finds all the new words and makes a list for the team of what the new words are in the story. And then the writing team, has to edit the story to limit the number of new words. And so we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. Once they've got it edited down and they think everything's good, they give it back to the word control person to recheck the story. And once they're satisfied that we're within our word limit, then the writing team can go on to the next story. Now, you can have several groups working on stories at once. You don't have to have everybody working on one story. In fact, you may have two or three, maybe even three writing teams that are going through and editing the story for new words. So let's just take a little bit of a look at what this might look like. So here's a text. Ultimate consumer means a person or a group of persons, generally constituting a domestic household, who purchases eggs, generally at the individual stores of retailers, or purchase and receive deliveries of eggs at the place of abode of the individual or domestic household from producers or retail route sellers, and who use such eggs for their consumption as food. So I hope that enlightened you about the definition of ultimate consumer. Well, maybe not. So let's take a look at how we can simplify this a little bit. So we could start out with ultimate consumer means a person. While this is other additional information or a group of persons generally constituting a domestic household, for the purposes of the definition, we don't necessarily need that detail. So we can put it aside. So let's take a look then at the next section, who purchases eggs. So the word purchases, that's an okay word, but the more syllables that are in a word, usually the more difficult the reading material for a new reader. So is there another word we could use for purchases? So how about the word buys? Ultimate consumer means a person who buys eggs. Okay, well, that's pretty good. So let's look at this next section. Generally, at the individual stores of retailers, or purchase and receive deliveries of eggs at the place of abode of the individual or domestic household from producers or retail route sellers. Whew, that's a mouthful. And really, for the purchase of our definition, our simplified definition, we don't really need to know where they're buying the eggs from. We just need to know that it's a person who buys eggs. Okay, that being said, so what are we going to do with this next section? And who use such eggs for their consumption as food? Okay, so we have eggs for their consumption as food. So if somebody consumes something as food, what are they doing? Well, that's a simpler word is eat. How about if we say to eat them? So we've taken this long paragraph with lots of stuff that makes it very difficult to understand the meaning. We've said ultimate consumer means a person who buys eggs to eat them. That's much easier to understand. Now, there's some other details in there that could be nice to know. You're defining more about, a group of persons or a you know, household, domestic household. But this is the ultimate core of the meaning there. And so, with some of our texts that will be helping the writers to simplify, their language writing team is doing the simplifying, the editing. But as a facilitator, you might need to help give them some ideas about how they can cut down on new words. So let's look at what that might look like. So when you're simplifying the text, you want to use the same word each time instead of synonyms. So sometimes a good translator, in our original stories, we've tried to use the same word consistently, but translators sometimes may think, oh, well, that's kind of boring. Let's change it up and use a synonym for that word instead, which is not a bad thing as a translator, but for our purposes, we want to make sure it remains simple. Sometimes we might need to take out detailed words that may have been added by the translator and are not in the original text. And oftentimes in the creation Bible story, the translators, we don't have the days, the number of days, like day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. We say day 1, then we say the next day, the next day, the next day. And sometimes they want to add in the numbers of the days, which, I mean, that's nice detail, but it adds new words. And so sometimes they need to take those back out. And if necessary, we may need to leave out details of the translated story to limit the new words. And knowing that the reader will get the details in other health materials or in the Bible itself later for the Bible stories. In addition, for the Bible stories, we want to check the questions at the end of the story. Once we've finished the editing, and the writer needs to check them, writing team, and make sure that the questions that are with the Bible story are still answered once it's been edited. And also that if the words have been changed somewhat, that the wording in the questions matches the wording in the story. So, and if a question is not answered in the edited story, just write a new question or take it out. So here's some examples of some stories from the Ga language in Ghana. And this is the English story about clean water. And you can see here that the Ga story is much simpler, not as many words. And maybe later we'll get a translation of that. I'm waiting to get a translation from some folks. And here's the first Bible story, God Made the World. You can see the amount of text here, and you can see that it's a much shorter story, so they've simplified it again to make it simpler for the new reader to limit the number of new words. All right, well, that's all for editing the Bible story, and yeah, we're on our way to completing those next 42 lessons for the new reader for our primer